Alrighty, welcome in everyone to the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We will be covering, first of all, the College Football Playoff has approved a new 5+7 format for the 2024 and 2025 season. We will get into the effects of that. And then we have a ton of changes happening in college football this year. I'll try to break down as many as I possibly can, and this might be a reoccurring segment because there are just so many happening in 2024. And then we'll get into some guys that have a lot of pressure on them going into 2024, some obvious candidates, and then some guys you maybe hadn't thought of, but definitely have a big target on their back, a big stuff on their shoulders, really, going into the season. And then we'll finish it up with Spotlight Wednesday, a new segment here where we are going to break down a new team every week. This week it is going to be the Miami Hurricanes. So if you're a Miami Hurricanes fan, stick around till the end to see that for sure. But before we start, I do want to bring to your attention that if you are wanting to ask a question, we do get a lot of those throughout the show. So the best way for you and us to get that question is to use the link at the bottom of the screen, streamelements.com/gsmcsportsnetwork./tip. It's a huge help not only to us, but to you all if you want to ask a question and want to see it on the screen and I can answer it as to the best of my ability. So definitely use that if you would like to ask a question. But let's jump right in because it has been a crazy couple of weeks in college football, and that is not changing anytime soon, of course. But the thing that happened this week that has kind of set the world on fire has been the college football playoff deciding to move to a 5+7 format, which would mean five auto bids for the conference champions of the top five conferences, and then seven at-large bids. Now, they had previously thought they were going to do a 6+6 format, which would be obviously six auto bids and six at-large bids, but they obviously, with the Pac-12 kind of dissolving over the last couple of years, only Oregon State and Washington State being left out over there, they've changed that approach, obviously. They still want to include a group of five conference champions, so they did include that fifth auto bid, which, you obviously love to see a lower conference be able to get in on the action, and especially in this expanded playoff, you don't want it to just be all the teams right up at the top fighting it out. You do want some Cinderella stories if you can. So you got to like that if you are a fan of a MAC team or a Sun Belt or Conference USA. You have a shot in this. And obviously there's a ton to overcome once you get into the playoff, but at least you'll be able to get on the dance floor and see what happens. This is very interesting for me for a number of reasons. Obviously, the 2024 season will be totally different. We will be talking about totally different matchups, meaning a lot of things when in past years they maybe have been kind of diminished by the four-team playoff and not being able to get in. We will have teams with two losses, possibly even a team with three losses finding their way into the playoff. So the conversations will be totally different throughout 2024. But I think something to keep in mind when looking at this is they changed course pretty quickly on this one. There was plans for a very long time for it to be 6+6 in 2024 and 2025, and then for them to come back to the table and figure out where they sit and what the best path forward is from there. They didn't even get to the 6+6 before they changed the formatting of the playoff, and I think that at the very least shows us that these people are going to be malleable throughout this process. College football is going through a state of change, which we will talk about in the next segment, but they're obviously willing to budge, right? They're willing to adapt to the different circumstances around them, especially when conference realignment is involved and you see a lot of teams leaving a conference, making it less viable. I mean, the Pac-12 is currently kind of fighting to be seen as a viable conference, even though there's only really two of them out there. So I think that might be an uphill battle. But all this to say, I think what happens in 2024 when throughout this offseason, let's say Florida State finds their way out of the ACC for free in this scenario, but let's say even if they find it out for some type of settlement between the crazy 400 million or 700 million, whatever the number you've heard, and the $0 that Florida State would much prefer to pay. The question is now, what happens if Florida State's able to get out and then Clemson follows suit? North Carolina's right there, Virginia Tech, Georgia Tech. What happens basically if the ACC folds within the next even 6 months? We've talked about how quickly this can happen, and we talked about the battle between the ACC, and Florida State yesterday. And it's going to be a real battle, and Florida State, I tend to believe, is going to come out on top. So the question is then, do you take another auto bid away? Do you move to 4+8? Do you change the format entirely? Basically, things are going to keep changing, right? Things are going to keep developing in this conference realignment, and we've seen that even recently with Florida State against the ACC. So the question is, how long do we have the 5+7 until we get to the 4+8, or until we get to a 16-team playoff and have it totally different, until we get to maybe no such thing as auto bids, which I tend to like. I'll be totally honest, I'll get into that more a little bit later, but I think this at the very least shows that the college football playoff is willing to come to the table really at any point. So with the changing world in college football right now, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if Florida State were to come out on top in the court battle between the ACC and were able to leave, and the ACC started to kind of crumble before our eyes. I wouldn't be surprised if we went into 2025 with a 4+8, and then they were right back at the table after 2025, because the SEC and the Big Ten have gobbled up so many teams and have become so powerful in this space that they come to the table and say, why should we be giving any auto bids to these smaller conferences? Why should we be giving any credence to the people that aren't as talented as us, aren't at playing the same level of game as us? And obviously, that's not necessarily ideal for college football in my mind. I mean, you'd love to see the best teams go at it, and I think if you're going to be at this point, I don't necessarily love auto bids in general, but that doesn't necessarily mean I don't love a group of 5 team getting into the mix, right? College football, one of the great things about it is you have so many different products across so many different levels, and the group of 5 is a massive part of the FBS and a massive part of college football overall. So seeing a team like Tulane, seeing a team like Buffalo, if they can find their way in, seeing a team like UCF, or USF, which we will absolutely be talking about in the coming days here. There's tons of teams that maybe aren't the top 12 teams in the country. In fact, I can probably confirm that none of the teams I just listed will be a top 12 team in the country in 2024. But what I can say is those teams could run the table. They could go 11-1 and win their conference title and be right in the mix in terms of what they've accomplished by what's in front of them, right? You can't play anyone else than the people that are scheduled for you, right? So a team that goes 11-1 or goes 12-1 or goes 13-0 in a smaller conference and finds their way in even beyond this auto bid process, I think it's something to keep an eye out on, because the question is now, at least for 2024 and possibly 2025, is the auto bid the only way that these smaller conferences get in? I tend to believe that is the case. I think we will see 5 auto bids, 1 from the group of 5, and then we will have 7 at-large teams that, if I'm being totally honest, I think about 6 of them could come from the SEC and the Big Ten, and then have 1 from the Big 12 or the ACC. Now, all of that is still very much up in the air, especially for 2024, because the ACC is still there, still has tons of really good teams. The Big 12 has a lot of really intriguing teams in Utah and Kansas State and Texas Tech and all these different teams that could possibly make a run. I really like the Kansas State team in particular, but I guess the question is, if this is the first step, right? If this is the first compromise they're willing to make in this whole grand scheme of things, where does it stop? And I guess who are the people that can make that happen? And I tend to believe not only right now, but going forward, especially into 2025 and 6 and 7 and so on, the SEC and the Big Ten are only going to become bigger powerhouses, right? They're only going to wield more power in terms of viewership and in terms of dollars, which really, there are a lot of people that make decisions in the sport where if you have, the most money rolling in, it's hard for them to go against you in a lot of ways. So I think the SEC and the Big Ten could very easily wield a lot of that power to change the playoff kind of at their leisure. And obviously, there's going to be some hurdles to get over there. There's not this, ability for them to just walk in the room, snap their fingers, and everything to change into their favor. But what I will say is they're going to be the power holders in college football, them and, the media companies. And a lot of the media companies have deals with these conferences. So I guess the question is, when you come to 2025 and a team from the group of five hasn't won a playoff game, and the teams from the ACC and the Big 12 have won maybe one, maybe Kansas State or Florida State makes a run in their last year in the ACC, and you're looking in 2026 and you're thinking the only teams that really make runs in this playoff format are SEC and Big 10 teams, which is I tend to believe that's what's going to happen. Now, obviously, there's tons of variables to go there. I think there will be some teams that come out of nowhere. That's what happened with TCU, not, even 2 years ago. So I guess the question is, how long till the SEC and Big Ten wield their power and can kind of just decide what the future of this thing is? And I think if they were to do that, the auto bids would be essentially wiped out pretty quickly. Now they could drop it to 2 or whatever number they see fit, but I do think we will be seeing kind of a slow drop in that number, not only because we will see the SEC and Big Ten be so dominant in this new era, but also we're going to see less and less conferences be viable conferences. A year ago, we didn't necessarily think the Pac-12 was going to fold before our eyes, and then it happened very quickly. So whether it's the ACC with Florida State fighting right now, or it's the Big 12 with their new structure, maybe it doesn't work out. I don't know. But the question always has been in this sport, how do you even out the disparity between the haves and the have-nots, right? How do you fix this massive gap that is forming? And I'm not sure there's a great way to do it, if I'm being totally honest. I think unless in this next year or this next couple of years where we have this format, a group of 5 team can break through and can make some noise in the playoff and make it be known that this isn't, a fluke. This is something that can be done by these teams throughout the year. I think it's going to be really hard to come to the table and argue against the SEC and the Big Ten and all of the things that they bring into the sport, especially with the new people coming in. I mean, Texas and Oklahoma bring a massive new market to the SEC. The Big Ten is adding a ton of people from the West Coast that probably didn't watch the Big Ten much on their Saturdays. So it's a lot of stuff is changing, and I don't think this college football playoff format will be the last one that we see. Maybe not even the last one we see before the 2025 season. But for 2024, we are looking at a 5+7 format. I like the format. I think it'll be very interesting to see how it all comes together. And I think one thing to keep in mind just at the end here is the 5 auto bids are not necessarily the top 5 seeds in this thing. So an auto bid could go to the number 12 team, which hypothetically would probably be the group of 5 team in this scenario. But it'll be interesting to see how this works. I'm personally kind of hoping for some smaller teams to make some runs, keep some of the regionality, some of the levels of conferences, and keeping the viability of the group of 5 alive. But there's a ton to be seen, and everything's changing and moving all at once, and it feels like a lot of people are being kind of turned off by that idea. And I think I might just have to do a Good Vibes Monday just to remind everyone why this sport is so special, why we love this sport so much, and why I think it's going to be okay. Now that I think is very, very, that's in all caps, but I do think it's going to be okay, but tons to be seen, and the college football playoff is just one of the changes that is coming next year. So, but when we come back from break, we're going to break down all the different changes. Now, I probably won't get to them all because, man, there are tons, but I will try to make it easy on you all, give you a one-stop shop for a ton of different changes happening across the country. But we are going to take a short break before that, so stick with us, and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits some loose shit. A stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the new college football playoff format and the possible changes that might be coming to that in the coming years, because it changed pretty quickly on us before the season even started. So, but we'll go from one change to all of the changes that could be happening. There is so much stuff happening across the sport, so many different things changing and evolving as we speak right now. There's stuff changing in this sport, but before we get into all of that, I do want to remind you all, we do get questions throughout the show, and I would love to see them obviously come across my screen. So the best way to do that is to use the link at the bottom of the screen, streamelements.com/GSMC Sports Network, /tip. It's super helpful not only to us here at the network, but super helpful to you all to ask a question and see it come across the screen, and maybe we can get into a little back and forth here. So definitely use that if you'd like to ask a question. But let's talk about changes in college football. I've been doing live streams for the last couple of days, and I've realized 90% of what I'm talking about is something that either didn't exist 5 years ago or wasn't a big part of the sport or is just going to change in 2024, whether that's coaching or conference realignment or everything else. So I thought this would be a good time to give you a one-stop shop. This 15-minute segment where you can come and see a ton of the changes that are happening now. I wish I could tell you that I got into everything, but couldn't possibly do that. I'll be totally honest. There are too many things happening across conference realignment, coaching changes, which this coaching cycle might have been one of the craziest we've had. I mean, 2021 was particularly wild with Lincoln Riley and Brian Kelly moving between two big schools in themselves, but the sheer amount of moves that have happened in this cycle have been absolutely insane. So we'll get into all that. And then the transfer portal, the thing that never sleeps, the thing that we not many people are too fond of, but it's the reality of the sport. So I will try to break down a couple of the big names. I got 5 names today. This will definitely be a reoccurring thing, new same name, new places type of thing, because there are so many guys going different places. And then a couple of rule changes that might be in store for the 2024 or even going forward in this sport. So it'll be very interesting to see all of this stuff unfold. But let's start with conference realignment, because it is the thing that tends to make the people most upset. Let's get it over with, get it out of the way real quick. Tons of stuff has happened since Texas and OU made their decision to go to the SEC. That was obviously kind of the first step in this, crazy new world we live in college football. And that is officially coming into effect in the 2024 season. Both teams coming into the SEC, kind of riding high after last year. Obviously, Texas coming off a playoff run, 12-2 season, Big 12 championship. OU improved dramatically in the 2023 season with a 10-2 record after a 6-7 year one under Brent Venables. But I like both these teams. They're going into a league that is obviously going to be much tougher week in and week out. So we'll see how they react to that. But definitely were the teams that started all this craziness, right? And then they were pretty quickly followed up. Obviously, it took about a year for all of this to coalesce, and it all came out last offseason. But I'm sure there were people working at the Pac-12 very quickly after the news dropped around Texas and Oklahoma. I talked about in the last segment that Oregon State and Washington State are all alone in the Pacific Northwest over there, and they will be playing mostly Mountain West teams this next year. And it'll be very interesting to see just how all of that works, right? It's not necessarily something we've seen, two teams just standing alone being their own conference. Obviously, you have independent teams that play a ton of different opponents, and maybe we'll have a segment in the coming days about what Notre Dame looks like in the future of college football, because there's a lot of question about where they fit into all this craziness. But for the Pac-12, I mean, I think it's going to be really hard to argue that you deserve the same shake of a Big 12 or an ACC or even, someone like the Sun Belt, who has 14 teams and has, set up this structure where Oregon State and Washington State are kind of figuring it out on the fly. Obviously, a new commissioner in there, Teresa Gould, the first female commissioner of the Power Five. I mean, if you want to call it a Power Five now, but still a remarkable accomplishment for not only her, but for the conference. And that is it in the Pac-12 right now. Oregon State and Washington State just kind of hanging out, doing their own thing, playing Mountain West teams. And then, obviously, you have Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA heading to the Big Ten. Those are the biggest losses for this conference, I think, by a fairly comfortable margin. Oregon is building into something that is going to have to be reckoned with in the coming years. Dan Lanning knows exactly what he's doing. The roadmap seems very simple to me and seems like he's executing it to perfection so far. Obviously, not the year that they wanted last year, but they've reloaded and they're going to be ready to roll into the Big Ten, and we'll see how they react to all that. As for Washington and USC and UCLA, they're kind of in a different type of boat, sort of. I'm not necessarily as confident that they're going to come in and just jump in and roll over the conference. I think Oregon will be right up there among the top teams in the conference, but I think the rest of these teams will kind of struggle to start, if I'm being honest. Washington has lost a ton, USC kind of the same, and UCLA is just not at a point as a program where I think they can compete week in, week out against some of the teams that they're going to have to. Now, I really do like this UCLA team. We'll get into a coaching hire that they had to make here in a second. But it's no secret that the LA market means a ton to whatever conference has it. And for the past, however long, the Pac-12 has been able to kind of lean on that, whether it's, when USC was the belle of the ball, when they were the team to watch, the amount of money that they were bringing in for that conference was just ridiculous. I'll be totally honest. And now, Oregon took over the reins for a little bit there with, all the different uniforms and all the different changes going on. They had Chip Kelly in town that recently got let go, or didn't get let go, left UCLA with a lot of quotations there. But basically, these four teams are just huge blows to the Pac-12. Going into the future, these felt like the four teams that, you would want if you were someone, and the Big Ten was able to get them all. So huge props to them. Obviously, not the greatest for the Pac-12, but that was not where the casualty ended. Stanford, SMU, and Cal are heading to the ACC, which is a huge change, obviously. Not necessarily the biggest hit to the conference. SMU not in the Pac-12, obviously. But something to keep an eye on. The ACC has 17 teams, which feels very clunky, but we'll see how that unfolds. Arizona, Arizona State, and Colorado heading in Colorado and Utah heading to the Big 12. Tons of teams that could make some noise. Colorado, Arizona, Utah, and Arizona State in a couple of years, I think, could all be very big players in that conference. And then we talked about Texas OU to the SEC. And then finally, the only change at the lower level between last year and this year was Kennesaw State jumping up to the FBS and joining the Conference USA. A very good team at the FCS level the last couple of years. They will have to, do that 2 years that JMU had to do where they can't play in postseason. But very cool to see more teams kind of making that jump from the FCS level to the FBS level. But now let's get into head coaching hires. This is going to be a little bit more rapid fire because, man, there are a ton of them. But a couple that really stood out to me throughout this cycle, and I broke down some good coaching hires on last show, not only head coaches, but coordinators and such, if you would like to check that out. But the head coaches are all over the place. Deshaun Foster was hired at UCLA after Chip Kelly left for Ohio State. A former player at UCLA, I think a huge energy guy. I'm very excited to see what he can build in LA. And then we had Willie Fritz take over for Dana Holgorsen at Houston. He's coming from Tulane. He had a chance, it sounded like a year ago, to take the Georgia Tech job, decided to go away from that and go towards the Houston job. And he can do a ton in that city if you just recruit that city. The amount of talent in that place is insane. So very interested to see what he can build. Very, very good coach. Jeff Levy finding his way over to Starkville, Mississippi. He was the OC at Oklahoma a year ago, and it will bring back kind of what that Mike Leach era had, right? That fast offense that's going to wear you out, throw the ball a lot, and have some fun. So excited to see what that looks like in Starkville. Brett Brennan takes over at Arizona, which is a huge deal because Jed Fish obviously moved on to Washington, which is another head coach here. And then Mike Elko taking over at Texas A&M was one of the coaches that I really love the hire. I think he fits there perfectly, even though I don't necessarily love the term fit too much. I think it just makes sense for him to be the Aggies head coach. And then we had Jonathan Smith going to Michigan State from Oregon State. This felt like years ago, if I'm being totally honest. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, so much stuff has happened since he has departed to East Lansing, and man, it's crazy. I saw that come across my screen when I was trying to figure out who I wanted to cover, and I had totally forgotten about that one, I'll be totally honest. And then finally, one that I really love, who took over for Willie Fritz in Tulane, is John Summerall. He came over from Troy, has done really incredible things there the last couple of years, and very excited to see what he can do. As I said, that's not even half of what we have, so this is definitely something that we will revisit, but just kind of to give you an idea of some of the crazy changes. Obviously, Nick Saban retiring, Kalen DeBoer at Alabama, Jim Harbaugh leaving, Sharon Moore at Michigan. I felt like I didn't need to say those because those are all over the place, but those are some other names that have changed places, and some players that have changed places. I have 5 guys that are really, really important to not only their team, but college football as a whole going into next year. And let's start with DJ Uiagalelei, the new face of the Florida State program. And I love this fit for him, not only from a schematic standpoint. I think Alex Atkins is just an incredible fit for him, but also I think he fits into that program. Mike Norvell obviously really values young men that have a great head on their shoulders. We saw Jordan Travis handle himself with as much grace as you possibly could in a situation that was really, really tough for him. So I think he fits in perfectly there. Another guy that I think fits in perfectly is Dylan Gabriel at Oregon, taking over for another veteran guy that's played a lot of football, that has, plays with his head and makes all the right decisions in Bo Nix. And it just made total sense when he decided to go to Oregon. And Excited to see what he can do there. Quinshon Judkins, we've talked about a little bit, a running back that went from Ole Miss to Ohio State. One that really surprised me. There some people that thought NIL played a big role. I'm not sure about all that, but obviously a huge addition for the Buckeyes, and another huge addition for them was Caleb Downs. I've talked about it a couple of different times. I love this kid. He is just so good. He plays so instinctively. He is so fast, and he led Alabama in tackles as a freshman, which I don't think anyone's done since about the 1970s. So just to put into context about how crazy he was, and one of his teammates from a year ago, Isaiah Bond, has made his way to Texas. Someone who I think is going to be a huge part of that passing attack, could very easily be wide receiver one for Texas next year, even though I think it's going to be a lot of spreading the ball around. But Isaiah Bond did not have a drop the entirety of last year, so a sure-handed guy that you're bringing in for a passer of the football in Quinn Ewers that's as good as there is in the country. So a lot to look forward there for Texas fans. And then we have some rule changes. Obviously, that's not the last time we will talk about transfer portal guys because, Lord, there is so many. But possible rule changes going into the 2024 season. One of the big things that has been talked about for ever since the Michigan stuff came out, really, was the in-helmet communication. It is possibly coming. There are a lot of people pushing for that. Some not as excited about that, but I'm a big fan personally. I think it just makes the most sense. They do it a ton at the NFL level. And it will make everything much more efficient. It would make everything a little bit more streamlined, and obviously it would take out that chance for signal callers to be, caught and be stolen and create a whole big problem for a ton of different people. But another one coming is officials are apparently pushing to add the 2-minute warning to college football. Obviously, in 2023, we had the running clock until under 2 minutes, which is an NFL rule that has made its way down to college football. This is another one that they would like to add in. I'm not necessarily quite as big a fan of this one. I don't necessarily think it'll hurt much, if I'm being totally honest. But I like the subtle differences between the two levels, so I'd prefer to keep that one the same, but I think no harm, no foul for that one. And then just kind of a scheduling hiccup going into this new craziness around college football with all of the conference realignment and all of the different number of teams in different conferences and different scheduling models. The Big Ten is currently set to play home and aways against every single team every 5 years. So that would mean, playing Oregon would play absolutely every single team at home, would play absolutely every single team away, at least in the span of the 5 years. The ACC, on the other hand, specific teams might not play each other for 7 years, which is just insane. I think it's another reason we need uniform scheduling in the sport, because it just doesn't make any sense that these teams would not be matching up more often, and we wouldn't be using these bigger conferences to see more different matchups that we haven't seen in the past. So definitely something to keep an eye on there. But that's all I got, at least for today. There is still plenty that is new in college football, and I probably will be coming back with this segment down the road. But for right now, that's all I got. But we're going to take a short break, and when we get back, we are going to talk about some of the most pressured individuals going into the 2024 season. Some of them are obvious, some aren't quite as obvious, but we got a couple for you in the next segment, so stick around and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back. We just talked about all of the changes that are going on around college football, Did not get to all of them because it might just be physically impossible, but got to a ton of them. So if you want to see all those changes, definitely check that out. And now let's talk about some of the most pressured individuals going into 2024. There are tons of guys that have a lot on their shoulders. And let's start with a couple of the obvious ones, if you will. Kalen DeBoer, this is a duh. That's literally the first bullet point I wrote down for this one. He's taking over for a guy that was essentially the sport for a really, really long time in Nick Saban, and it's always going to be tough, right? There's no reality where you walk into a job after someone like Saban has left, or down the road, whoever takes over for Kirby Smart at Georgia. It's going to be a nightmare. I won't lie to you. It's going to be a lot of long hours, a lot of really tough things to figure out. But just on top of that, just to add to DeBoer's craziness that he's had to deal with, is he's taking over a job that has had infinite amount of staff changes, tons of roster changes. It's been really hard for him to, really get comfortable because he's constantly putting out fires, constantly trying to fit in guys that they absolutely need. They got Keon Saab in the portal. That will not be the last guy they get in the portal, I don't think, throughout this process. But he's basically been dropped into a very, very tough situation, and every single day it feels like the situation gets a little bit tougher and a little bit tougher, which is obviously not what he's wanted. And I think he's very excited of pretty much anyone in the country to get to spring ball and to be coaching football again and to be on the football field, because I think he has kind of gotten a little bit tired, I'll be honest, of doing all of the stuff but coaching football. So I think he's very excited to get back to that. And I think another factor in all of this pressure that is building up around him and his OC, Nick Sheridan, who was elevated after Ryan Grubb left, tons of pressure on him to make this offense work with Jalen Milroe coming back. But another factor to be put into this is Alabama fans have been spoiled. They will tell you that, I'm sure. It is no secret across the country. Nick Saban has absolutely spoiled these people with national titles left and right, with SEC championships, with basically just expecting to beat everyone on the schedule every single year, which is not a realistic thing for 99% of teams in sports. So it has been a wild time in Tuscaloosa, and with that comes somewhat unrealistic expectations. I'll be honest. I think while Alabama fans will try their darndest to not put as much pressure on Kalen DeBoer as they did on Nick Saban to always be in the mix, to always win 11, 12 games, to always be fighting for a national title, I think it's going to be really hard not to, right? They have Georgia coming to town early on in their conference schedule, and if that goes the wrong way, you will see a lot of upset Crimson Tides fans very quickly. So how does he deal with all that will be a huge part of not only 2024, but moving forward. How can he kind of subside all of the fans' worries about maybe his, ability to do this job? Because if he stumbles a little bit, they will be on him very, very quickly. I promise you that. So tons on his shoulders. He might be the number one guy that is under the most pressure just because of the position he's in, taking over for the greatest coach of all time in Nick Saban. Another is Sharon Moore. Obviously, taking over for Jim Harbaugh is really, really tough. Taking over for Jim Harbaugh after a national title is particularly tough because the last, I think 6 national title teams have had the most players drafted and have had the most players leave for the draft. Michigan has the most players invited to the NFL Combine with 18. So just to give you an idea, he has to take over for one of the better coaches we've had in the sport over the past couple of years. He has to replace a ton of really good defensive coaches in particular, but also some, special teams coordinator in Jay Harbaugh that went to Seattle, and he's got to do all of this while also putting together a national title defense run, which is not an easy thing to do. I think we saw in 2022, Georgia made it look relatively easy. And then they had to play Ohio State, and you realize, man, these guys have been giving absolutely everything all year, and that was an absolute dogfight. Was probably the best game of all of that year, and it's incredibly hard to repeat. It's incredibly hard to even get your guys up to, be back in the Big Ten championship after this year because of the amount of people they're losing. But the talent is still very much there. They hired Wink Martindale as their defensive coordinator. It will be a very interesting thing to watch because his time in the Giants was not necessarily his best, but obviously a very, very smart guy that's been around football for a very, very long time. So I have full confidence that he'll be able to make that defense work, even with all the departures that have happened. And then they got to face Texas week 2. So he's another guy that will be under a spotlight very early on against a very, very good team in Texas. So it's going to be a tough draw for Sharon Moore. I really like him. I think he's very, very good. But the question is, how does he adapt to this, crazy change in roster, in coaching, in possibly philosophy going forward? There's tons of different things to come into play here, and Sharon Moore's got to balance all of it. So right up there with Kalen DeBoer is Sharon Moore taking over for two just legends of the game in a lot of ways. But let's get to a couple of quarterbacks here, and let's start with Quinn Ewers, a guy that did not go into the NFL draft. Now, he wasn't necessarily going to be a part of that top 3, the Caleb Williams, Drake May, Jaden Daniels group. But I think anyone that has been following the draft has seen it's pretty much those 3 guys and then a big gap. There's a big question mark at quarterback 4. There's tons of people being thrown out there, from Michael Penix to J.J. McCarthy to maybe even Spencer Rattler. Tons of guys that could find their way into that 4 spot. And I don't think Quinn Ewers would have been necessarily any different if he had pulled the trigger, gone into the NFL draft, gone through a combine, gone through a pro day. His arm talent is very obvious. His ability is very obvious to throw the ball. So I think he would have gotten a lot of teams' eyes. I think he would have possibly even found his way into the first round because of the craziness going on around the quarterback position, and 3 guys possibly be taken 1, 2, and 3. He could have been right there. But the reality is he came back for a reason. He came back because he wants to win a title. He was right there. They were a play away from beating Washington, and then who knows what happens in the national title game. So he very obviously wants to win a title. He wants to be the guy that brings Texas all the way back, not just, that was a fun season, let's see what happens next season type of thing. He wants to be the guy that lifts the trophy for them, and I think that's very clear. So him coming back is a message not only to Texas fans and to, the SEC, but college football as a whole. And I think he's going to have a really good season in 2024. If he can follow it up with possibly even a trip to NYC after a really good 2023 campaign, he might just be up there for the number 1 pick. I think he'll be battling Carson Beck pretty much all year for that spot, and it'll be interesting to see how that works out. And then I don't love addressing this because I don't think it'll play much of a part in the season, but if he does struggle, people will be talking about Arch Manning. That is a layer of this that you have to at least touch on, and although it's a little goofy and it probably won't matter, it is something that will happen, and it's something he will have to deal with. And then we got Will Howard, the quarterback at Ohio State. This really just all comes back to Ohio State has been littered with incredible quarterbacks. C.J. Stroud, Justin Fields, tons of guys. I can't even, Dwayne Haskins. There's a million incredible quarterbacks that have come through Ohio State. And then last year was a little bit frustrating from that position. Kyle McCord just not playing as consistent of football as they would have liked. So Will Howard has tons of pressure on him from the Ohio State fan base to be that guy, to be the guy that they brought him in to be, which is a guy that can just execute everything around him. And he'll have tons of, toys to play with, obviously. Emeka Egbuka, Brandon Inniss, and Carnell Tate are wildly talented. Jeremiah Smith coming in as the top wide receiver. It's just insane. And then you add in the running backs. It's a embarrassment of riches over there. So he should be able to execute. He is an efficient guy. Having Chip Kelly in his corner now can only really help the situation. And then I think the question is, if he starts to struggle, if the first couple of weeks aren't quite as smooth as Ohio State fans would have liked, what does that conversation look like in that, locker room or on the Twitter, pages, or especially in those message boards that people get a little bit rowdy in around the season time. It'll be interesting to see how he handles all the pressure that not only comes with just being the Ohio State quarterback, but especially after the year that they had with Kyle McCord a year ago. They need better quarterback play from Ohio State. They need the quarterback play they're used to. And the guy that I tend to believe might be under the most pressure going into this year is Ryan Day. And there's a number of reasons for this. I think, namely, what everyone knows, he has to beat Michigan. There is no two ways about it. He literally cannot lose that game. I think he could genuinely go 11-1 up to that game. If he loses that game and, let's say, maybe doesn't even get into the Big Ten championship because of that, I think he's out the door. And maybe that's a little bit hasty. Maybe that's a little bit ridiculous to think an 11-1 season would not do the trick, but that's the game. That's the game that you have to win. It's the same problem that Will Howard's going to have. You have to win that game. So Chip Kelly needs to hit. He needs to get into the playoff. He needs to compete for a Big Ten championship. There are tons of things that are on the checklist for Ryan Day going into 2024. And on top of all this, just to add to the fun for him, Ohio State just brought in the new athletic director from Texas A&M, Ross Bjork. And Ross Bjork is a good athletic director. I think he'll be successful at Ohio State. But one thing about him that is absolutely true, that will always be true, I'm sure, is he is not afraid to spend money. He is not afraid to go after the big fish. He obviously hired Jimbo Fisher during his time at Texas A&M after getting rid of Kevin Sumlin. And then he hired Buzz Williams for a ton of money to coach their basketball team. So he's not afraid of letting go of a coach that might be, right around where they want to be, but not over the top, and then going all in on a new guy. So Ryan Day has to execute this year, because I think if he doesn't, it's going to be tough. Obviously, giving up play calling duties will help him a lot, but he's got to be closer to that Urban Meyer role, where kind of the GM over the team, the real head coach, not having to worry about game planning, not having to worry about that type of stuff, and just kind of let him be him. And it'll be really interesting to see how this goes, because every single week is going to matter for Ryan Day. If you lose to Rutgers in the middle of the season, it's going to be a problem, and the AD is going to be watching you very closely. So Ryan Day might be the most pressured individual in the entire country going into next year. But that's all I have in terms of players and coaches under a ton of pressure. There are still plenty more. Billy Napier is one that I wrote down here. Just didn't have quite enough time to get to him, but he's someone to watch. I'll put it that way. He is someone that could be up against it, especially with the schedule they're facing. But that's all I have for the time being. Definitely will revisit this, because there are a lot of people under pressure. There are a lot of people that have to deliver this year, or they could be looking for a new place to live around December. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that develops. But we will be taking a short break, and then we're going to come back with Spotlight Wednesday, and it is Miami Hurricanes time in the spotlight. We are going to talk about their outlook for the 2024 season, what kind of stumbled them up in the 2023 season, and just my general thoughts on what I think they're capable of doing in the 2024 season. But stick with us, and we will be right back. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the individuals in the sport that have the most pressure on them going into 2024, namely Ryan Day, that I got into a lot during that segment, so definitely check that out. And then it's time for Spotlight Wednesday, and for this, I'm going to pick a different team every week, maybe a team that you don't know as much about, some fringe contenders possibly throughout the offseason to just give you an idea of who they are going into the 2024 season. Now, still tons to develop throughout spring ball and everything, so this will definitely not be the last time I talk about the Miami Hurricanes, but I thought they would be a great team to start with because they're a very interesting team. Let's be honest, the 2023 season was not all that pretty. If you're a Miami Hurricane fan, you start 4-0 and then finish the season 7-6, and you have that absolute debacle playing Georgia Tech that I watched probably 10 different times and still couldn't fathom what I was watching. Still didn't understand how they even remotely thought that that was going to be something that they should do. But that's in the rearview mirror, right? And the great teams are the teams that are able to overcome situations like that and come back the next season and build and continue to build. And I think this is a team that, in particular, for a long time, at least while Mario Cristobal has been there have been a lot of people critical of what they've been able to accomplish. And obviously, it has not gone as smoothly as Mario Cristobal and company would have liked early on, but I still see a ton of telltale signs that this team is heading in the right direction, and it starts with Cam Ward. One of my favorite players in all of college football, I'll be totally honest. He is absolutely electric all over the place. Kind of reminds me of Jordan Travis from Florida State a year ago. A little bit more polished of a passer, but they're very similar guys in the athleticism and their ability to extend plays and make some just mind-boggling plays in a lot of ways. But he is someone that is so important for them. The quarterback play a year ago with Tyler Van Dyke / Emory Williams was just not good enough for them to compete. And if they're going to get there, Cam Ward is going to have to be the guy that, he's very capable of being. Went to the NFL draft, didn't necessarily love what he saw when he got his draft grades and found his way to Coral Gables, and he has tons to work with. That's one of the big strengths for them, is pretty much their entire offense. I'll be totally honest. Cam Ward, I talked about it, one of the most premier players in the entire sport. Xavier Restrepo and Jacoby George at wide receiver, both very, very talented and in different ways. Xavier Restrepo is the ultimate third down guy. Jacoby George can stretch the field like no one else. They're going to be an incredible duo to watch. And then Mark Fletcher, the running back that is going into his sophomore year, is an absolute dude. He is someone that came on late last year and really flashed a lot, and I'm very excited to see what him and Cam Ward can do in that run game, because it doesn't hurt to have, a quarterback read where the quarterback pulls and goes for 20 yards in your bag. And Miami will have that where they didn't have it in Tyler Van Dyke a year ago. So definitely something to watch there. Francis Mauanoa is one of the best offensive linemen in the entire country. And really across this entire offensive line, they've just been slowly getting better. Now there have been definitely some hiccups. Francis Mauanoa is still a very young kid, but uber talented, kind of the same vibes of Kelvin Banks over at Texas, who came in as a freshman, played immediately, played really good football, but there were some, hiccups, obviously, as a young player. There were some points where he didn't look as great, where he got beat, missed his read, whatever it is. And last year, which was Kelvin Banks' sophomore year, he absolutely exploded, was one of the best tackles in all of the country. And I think that's going to be the case for Francis this next year. Very excited to see him. Another freshman going into his sophomore year that's an absolute beast is Ruben Bain. He might genuinely be just the best player on this football team. He had 7.5 sacks as a freshman, and that is a pretty wild number when you really think about it. I mean, all of these guys, that come in tend to not be physically ready right away. He absolutely was. He is a specimen of a human. He is built different, as they say, than most of us out there. And I'm super excited to see what he can do because he will be one of the premier pass rushers in all of the country. But now let's get to some weaknesses because not any team is perfect, not any team is flawless, and really a lot of their problems happen on the defensive side of the ball. And a lot of it really just has to do with the people leaving, the people walking out the door, particularly on the back end. James Williams and Cam Kitchens, both super talented guys, and not only super talented, but very smart. And I think when you look at elite defenses pretty much across history, if you look at those back end safeties, they are smart, instinctive, they are different, which is a really big part of this. You have, two guys with varying skill sets, which is what they had a year ago, and it gives so much stability to the top end of that defense. Obviously, Cam Kitchens and James Williams didn't necessarily play their best football a year ago. No one on that defense really played their best football a year ago, but still guys that, were huge for communication, were huge for making some plays that younger guys wouldn't have made. So losing them is a huge deal. Another guy they lost is Leonard Taylor to the defensive tackle. Uber talented guy, a absolute run stuffer, and if you're gonna play, at an elite level, if you're gonna compete for a playoff, you pretty much have to be a good run defense, because if you're not a good run defense, you have to commit more people to the run, which opens up passing lanes, and those passing lanes can be pretty big in college, I'll be honest with you. So he's someone that has to be replaced, because if you can't play run defense, everything else around the defense just kind of crumbles. So he's huge. And then I think the biggest thing about this team is they're still relatively young. Across a lot of the lines in particular, they're a young team. They're a very talented team. They've recruited really well out of the portal and in high school, but these kids are still, 18, 19 years old, maybe even 20, and it's hard to make a run with a team that young, but the reality is there's tons of talent. Mario Cristobal is a good coach. He just has some problems down the stretch in certain decision-making points, but I do think this is a team that is still on track, is still in line with what this rebuild was going to look like, because it was a full rebuild, which is something that I think some people didn't fully understand when he came there. I think they thought Miami had just been sitting with tons of talent and were ready to roll. That was not the case. I'll be totally honest. It wasn't a bad team by any means, but there were tons of things that needed to happen, especially across that offensive line, across both lines, that were going to take them to the next level. And all of that has slowly happened. It's just hasn't quite coalesced into wins on the field, but who knows what happens in 2024. They could very well be a team that jumps into that ACC and it's wide open right after Florida State. So we'll see what happens there. But let's get into the schedule, because the schedule is what holds a lot of weight for a ton of these teams. There's so many talented teams across the country that teams like Arkansas in past years, or teams like South Carolina, what feels like every single year, or Florida going into this next year, all of these teams are really good. All of these teams have a ton of talent. All of these teams have ability, but they're playing so many good teams throughout the year that it makes it really hard to have that incredible record at the end of the year. Miami does have a little bit more of a navigable schedule. Now, they play tons of Power 5 opponents. They play, first of all, to start the year, they start in Florida, or at Florida, which is a huge battle. Will tell a lot about what this team is going forward. Although when Florida went to Utah and beat them a year ago, we thought this Florida team is different, and then it didn't really coalesce into anything. But to start the year with a win, especially against a team in your state, is just huge. So very interested to see what happens there. Then they should really be able to roll into their first bye week for the most part. They do have Virginia Tech and Cal in conference, but both those games should be wins hypothetically this early on in the process. But And then after the bye week, it's time to really strap in and start playing your best football because you got at Louisville, Florida State, and Duke at home on back-to-back weeks. And then you go to Georgia Tech, which I've talked about a little bit, is a team some people might be overlooking, a team that could definitely spring some upsets very easily this coming year. But overall, this is a very doable schedule. Now, it's not going to be easy. They're going to have to beat some teams that maybe they're not necessarily slated to beat right now. I think at Louisville will be one of those games that they really need to win. Florida, another one that's a very important thing to, if you win those two games, you could be 10-2 with losses to Florida State and Duke, or you could be 8-4, and that is a totally different thing when you're in your third year as Mario Cristobal, coming over from a school where you were massively successful at Oregon. So I think there are a couple of inflection points throughout the season. I think Louisville, through like halfway through the season, and then Florida to start the season are two times where we're really going to see what this team really is and where they fit into the 17 teams in the ACC right now. But as a general point about this team, I really do like this team. I think there's talent all over the field, especially on the offensive side of the ball. I think Xavier Restrepo gives the ultimate security blanket to Cam Ward in learning that offense. Now the worries obviously are Mario Cristobal makes some head-scratching decisions down the stretch, especially that one against Georgia Tech, and you're hoping as a Hurricane fan he has learned from that and moved forward, but he made a mistake like that while he was at Oregon, and it happened again. So it'll be interesting to see how he kind of overcomes some of his woes there. Shannon Dawson hasn't quite hit his stride there as a play caller, but with Cam Ward in the room, it can only help, right? Having that elite quarterback is a huge help to these play callers because it not only opens the playbook, but it makes it easier when, they don't make the right call. Cam Ward can make a play out of nothing and make them look good. So it always helps to have someone like that as your, under center guy. And they're really young. So overall, there are some different points in this team that could be their demise. They're definitely a huge high floor, low ceiling, high ceiling, low floor teams because I could see the wheels entirely falling off. Maybe Cam Ward gets hurt. I really hope not, but that's always a possibility with this. Shannon Dawson maybe just isn't the right OC for this team. There's tons of things that could go wrong and totally collapse this, but if Shannon Dawson and Cam Ward get on the same page quickly, if Mario Cristobal, can fix some of the time management problems he's had in the past, if the young players can play up to their potential, this is a team that's very dangerous. And with Florida State sitting up top, everything else is open. And even Florida State, a team that is replacing tons of guys, that's kind of wide open. So Miami could very well be right there in the conversation for the ACC. And if you're in the conversation for the ACC next year, you're in the conversation for the playoff. So this Miami team obviously could be in the playoff. I could very well see them missing a bowl entirely, just because the wheels fall off, injuries, whatever. But it's a fascinating team that is going to go all types of directions in 2024. But I do like them. I think they're going to be very, very capable this upcoming year. It just comes down to execution, and we'll see what they can do with all of that in 2024. But that will do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please subscribe and leave a positive review. It is super helpful to us. We also invite you to follow on our Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all across those social pages because we release tons of content throughout the day, not only about college football. I know if you love college football and you see my face, that's what I'll be talking about, but tons of other people doing really good work across every single sport. So definitely follow on those pages to keep up to date with everything that you need to know. But that will do it for this edition. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next time.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like